In a genetics lab, far away from any classroom or courtroom, a team of researchers sat down with 2 sets of blood samples that would end up changing how millions of people understand themselves. One set represented West Africa, as it existed before any ship ever left its shore for the Americas, a huge patchwork of separate nations, each with its own bloodline stretching back thousands of years. The other set came from the descendants of the people who were taken from that same land, 300 years and an ocean away. The scientists expected to find a clear African signal running through those descendants. What they actually found was something nobody had prepared them for, a second bloodline quietly present in nearly every Black American genome, one that history books rarely explain and most people were never taught to search for. Once you understand where that second bloodline came from and what it actually reveals, it becomes very hard to look at American history the same way again. For a long time, this subject stayed locked away inside academic papers, read by a small circle of geneticists and largely avoided by everyone else. It touched 2 of the most sensitive topics in the entire country, race and slavery, and most researchers preferred to keep a safe distance. But DNA does not care about comfort. It does not forget, and it does not soften what it records. Generation after generation, it quietly stores exactly what happened to a population, whether society is ready to face it or not. When scientists finally developed tools sharp enough to read that record clearly, what came back was not some vague historical detail. It was a precise genetic trace of one of the darkest chapters in modern history, sitting inside the chromosomes of tens of millions of people alive today. To understand this properly, you have to go back further than most people expect, long before the first enslaved person was ever brought to American soil. The populations that would eventually be grouped together as Black America were never a single people to begin with. They were dozens of separate nations: Wolof, Mende, Akan, Igbo, Yoruba, Congo, Fulani, and many others, spread across an enormous stretch of West and Central Africa, from what is now Senegal all the way down through Ghana, Nigeria, and Angola. These groups were not simply regional variations of one another. They were as different genetically, culturally, and linguistically as the French were from the Norwegians, or the Italians were from the Russians. The common idea of one uniform African population boarding those ships is a modern oversimplification. What actually crossed the Atlantic was a staggering variety of distinct human lineages forced by violence into a single new identity that none of them had ever asked for. That forced compression is where the first part of this story hides. The transatlantic slave trade did not just relocate human beings from one continent to another. In a strange and horrifying way, it functioned almost like an uncontrolled experiment in population genetics, except the method was human suffering, and the sample size ran into the millions. Historians estimate that somewhere around 12.5 million people were forced onto ships headed for the Americas over the course of roughly 400 years. Close to 2 million of them never survived the journey. Entire family lines ended before they ever touched land. Regional populations that had existed separately for centuries were suddenly funneled together, filtered, and merged inside the holds of those ships, creating a population that had never existed anywhere in human history before. This new group of people, born directly out of catastrophe, would eventually come to call themselves African American. But that is only the beginning of what the DNA reveals. The deeper and more disturbing part of the story starts after those ships reached the shore. Once enslaved people arrived on plantations across the American South, something else began, something most textbooks mention in a single vague sentence before quickly moving on. When scientists examine the genomes of Black Americans today, they find that genetic mixing between enslaved Africans and the European people who enslaved them was not occasional or accidental. It was constant, it was widespread, and it left behind a genetic pattern so consistent and so mathematically clear that researchers can now use it to estimate roughly when this mixing happened, where it was most concentrated, and, in a detail that stops most people cold, exactly whose bodies carried the weight of it. This is the point where the comparison stops feeling like an abstract science lesson and starts to feel like reconstructing a crime. When researchers line up the genetic makeup of historical West African populations against the genomes of Black Americans living today, the difference is not small or subtle. On average, a Black American's genetic makeup includes somewhere between 15 and 25% European ancestry. That is not a number that can be explained away by a handful of scattered relationships across 2 centuries. Large studies consistently show African American populations carrying roughly 75 to 85% African ancestry, alongside that same 15 to 25% European share. Picture what that number actually means in practice. If you gathered 100 Black Americans at random, their DNA alone would tell you that, on average, somewhere close to 1 in every 4 or 5 of their ancestors, going back through the generations, was European. Not a distant, forgotten relative from centuries past. but a direct genetic contributor who entered the family line during a period when that family had absolutely no legal protection, no freedom, and no ability to refuse anything. And this is where the story becomes even more disturbing. Scientists did not stop at simply calculating how much European ancestry was present. They wanted to know when it entered the population, and the answer to that question tells its own painful story. Using statistical methods that track the length of inherited DNA segments passed down across generations, researchers were able to estimate the approximate time windows when African and European ancestry began blending into a single lineage. The pattern that emerged shows that the overwhelming majority of this mixing took place before the Civil War, during the exact decades when nearly the entire black population in America was enslaved and living under complete legal control. After slavery ended, the rate of this kind of mixing dropped sharply and almost immediately. Sit with that for a moment. The genetic blending was heaviest during the years of captivity, and it collapsed almost the instant that captivity ended. That is not the pattern you would expect from a society slowly blending together through voluntary relationships over time. That is the genetic fingerprint of an extreme and total power imbalance, one severe enough to leave a measurable spike in the human genome, followed by an equally measurable drop the moment that power was taken away. This is the point where the story shifts from statistics about ancestry into something far more troubling, because DNA does not just reveal that mixing occurred. It reveals who it happened to. That single detail turns a set of numbers into something closer to a testimony. Not every part of the human genome is inherited the same way. People carry 2 copies of most chromosomes, but the X chromosome follows its own separate rule. Women pass down 2 X chromosomes to their children, while men pass down only 1. That small biological quirk allows scientists to compare ancestry patterns on the X chromosome against ancestry patterns across the rest of the genome. The gap between those 2 numbers reveals something that is almost impossible to fabricate, whether the European ancestry entering a population came mainly from men, mainly from women, or evenly from both. What researchers discovered is something that should make anyone pause. The data consistently shows a higher proportion of African ancestry carried on the X chromosome compared to the rest of the genome. Historically, geneticists interpret this exact pattern as the signature of European men fathering children with enslaved African women far more frequently than the reverse. In other words, this is physical evidence embedded directly in human biology of coercion and exploitation carried out by enslavers against the very people they held captive. This is not a small footnote buried in a research paper. This is the genome acting as an unwilling witness, carrying forward into millions of living descendants a form of proof that no plantation ledger, no census record, and no personal diary from that era ever fully documented. Researchers who have spent years studying this pattern note that it shows up with striking consistency across regions, which is part of what makes it so unsettling. This was not confined to a small number of isolated, notorious plantations. This same sex-biased signature appears again and again across the entire historical geography of American slavery, from the tobacco farms of Virginia to the cotton fields of the Deep South. What most people picture as vague, distant references to mixed ancestry is, in reality, precise chromosome-level evidence of a system in which enslaved women had no legal ability to refuse anything, and the genetic consequences of that total lack of power are still measurable in their descendants nearly 2 centuries later. This is not randomness. This is the fingerprint of a structure that was built and maintained for generations. The story does not stop there, because ancestry is not distributed evenly across the country, and the geography behind that unevenness carries its own layered history. When researchers broke down Black American genomes by region, they found that the balance between African and European ancestry shifts noticeably depending on where a family's history took root. People in Deep South states such as Florida and South Carolina tend to carry a higher share of African ancestry, while communities in states like Kentucky and Virginia, along with families that eventually moved outside the South entirely, tend to carry a larger share of European ancestry. At first glance, this might look like a minor regional detail. It is not. It is the genetic residue of a second historical upheaval layered directly on top of the first. That second upheaval is the Great Migration, the movement of roughly 6 million Black Americans out of the rural South and into cities in the North and West, spanning from the early 20th century through the 1970s. People made this journey to escape the violence of Jim Crow laws and to search for economic opportunities the South refused to offer them. Researchers found that the regional genetic differences visible today trace directly back to how this migration reshaped the population, with the people who left carrying somewhat different ancestry patterns than those who remained behind. Here's the part almost nobody expects. The migration itself was not genetically random. Data shows that Black Americans who left the South during this period tended to carry slightly higher proportions of European ancestry than those who stayed, and that those who eventually settled in northern and western cities often carried even higher European ancestry than the communities already established in those cities before their arrival. In other words, the genetic map of Black America today is not simply a record of what happened during slavery. It is a layered record of two separate mass upheavals, stacked directly on top of each other, each one leaving its own measurable trace inside the population's DNA. The wound created in the 18th and 19th centuries never fully closed before a second historical disruption reshaped the picture again in the 20th. Think about what that layering actually means for two individual families. A Black family whose roots stayed in South Carolina and a Black family that eventually settled in Detroit might share almost no direct genealogical connection to one another. Yet both carry a genome shaped by the same underlying historical forces, expressed through two very different regional paths. One family's ancestors remained in the place where the earliest mixing occurred and were shaped primarily by 19th century plantation slavery. The other family's ancestors carried that same base history northward, and then absorbed a second wave of change during and after migration, arriving in cities where the surrounding population, the opportunities, and the dangers were completely different. Read closely enough, DNA does not just tell you that a person is African American. It can tell you something close to which specific historical current their family was caught up in, and roughly when. Most casual conversations about this subject stop at the level of percentages and probabilities, but the real weight of this story lies in what this data is now doing to a wall that has stood between Black Americans and their own family history for more than a century. Genealogists have a name for that wall. They call it the 1870 barrier. For most Black families researching their history, documented records hit a hard stop around that year because the 1870 census was the first time formerly enslaved people were recorded as full individuals with names rather than being listed as property under someone else's name or simply counted as numbers on a page. Before that date, for the vast majority of Black families in America, the paper trail simply does not exist. Not because those ancestors were not real, and not because their history did not happen, but because the system that enslaved them deliberately refused to record their existence as human beings with names, birthplaces, and family lines worth preserving. Millions of family histories were erased, not by accident, but by design. This is where the science shifts from simply documenting the past to actively working as a tool for repair. New genetic modeling techniques are now being developed specifically to help Black American families push their genealogical research past that wall of missing records, moving beyond basic ancestry percentages towards something closer to identifying specific ancestral contributors. Genealogists and geneticists working side by side are essentially trying to accomplish what 2 centuries of deliberate record destruction were designed to prevent, rebuilding, piece by piece, the family trees that slavery worked so hard to erase. It feels almost redemptive, and in some ways it truly is. But every step forward in that reconstruction also means confronting, in increasingly specific and undeniable detail, exactly how those family trees were broken apart in the first place. The story does not end at the edge of the old plantation. From here, it moves forward into the present, where the stakes shift from historical understanding to something with direct, ongoing consequences for the health of tens of millions of people alive right now. For decades, medical research in the United States was built almost entirely around the genomes of people of European descent. Clinical trials, risk calculators, disease prediction models, nearly all of it was designed using European genetic data, treated as though it represented some kind of universal human baseline. It does not. Because populations with African ancestry have been so severely underrepresented in genetic research, disease-related mutations specific to those populations have often been missed entirely. And medical tools built around European genetic data frequently work less accurately for patients of African descent. This is not a small technical oversight. It is a systemic blind spot sitting at the center of modern medicine, and it means that for a significant portion of the population, the genetic revolution in healthcare has quietly performed worse for longer, without most patients ever being told why. The consequences of that blind spot are not theoretical. They are showing up in real clinical research right now. A recent genomic analysis found that the balance between African and European ancestry in Black Americans appears connected to their risk levels for certain serious brain conditions, correlating with a higher risk for both Alzheimer's disease and stroke, but a lower risk for Parkinson's disease. Take a moment to consider that. The same ancestral mixture that was born out of historical violence is now being studied by scientists as a factor that may shape which diseases a person is more or less likely to develop centuries later, in ways that could eventually influence how doctors screen for, diagnose, and treat their patients. History did not just shape identity here, it shaped biology, and biology is now shaping the future of medical risk for an entire population. The deeper researchers dig into this issue, the more urgent it becomes. reviews of major genetic studies on conditions like coronary artery disease continue to find heavy reliance on research groups drawn almost entirely from European ancestry populations, even in studies published as recently as 2024 and 2025. This means the gap in representation that scientists flagged years ago still has not closed. The comfortable version of this story would suggest that science naturally catches up over time, that representation gaps close on their own as technology improves. The more accurate version, based on the most recent research available, is that this gap is not closing by itself. It has to be forced closed through deliberate, large-scale investment, and that effort is happening right now in real time. That is exactly why a new wave of large-scale genomic research projects has emerged over just the past few years. Projects specifically designed to correct a historical oversight that has distorted medicine for generations. One major initiative aims to sequence 500,000 genomes from people of African ancestry, driven by researchers who describe the effort as long overdue, given the enormous evolutionary depth and diversity found within African populations. Separately, a 2025 research effort sequenced whole genomes from more than 35,000 individuals, chosen specifically because the majority carried predominantly African genetic ancestry, aiming to uncover clinically important findings that earlier, Europe-centered studies were never positioned to detect in the first place. This is not gradual, incremental progress. This is an emergency correction, decades overdue, now unfolding at a scale large enough to genuinely reshape what doctors understand about an entire population's biology. And it is happening because earlier comparisons of African American DNA finally forced the scientific establishment to confront how much it had been missing all along. This is where the shift in power becomes impossible to ignore. For most of American history, the ability to define, categorize, and control Black identity belonged almost entirely to institutions run by other people. Enslavers who recorded human beings as property, census takers who erased names from official records, medical systems that treated one form of ancestry as the standard and everyone else as a deviation from it. The genome does not belong to any of those institutions. It cannot be edited by an old plantation ledger, and it cannot be reshaped after the fact by a biased study design. It simply exists, quietly embedded in every cell of the body, waiting for the right tools to read it honestly. Those tools finally exist now. For the first time in history, the descendants of enslaved people have access to a form of evidence about their own origins that cannot be erased by a missing record and cannot be dismissed as folklore. That is an extraordinary reversal, turning the very DNA that was once forcibly altered through violence into some of the clearest surviving proof of exactly what happened and to whom. But this reversal carries its own heavy weight, because reading this evidence honestly means confronting just how deeply violence and family lineage are intertwined in American history. It means acknowledging that for a huge share of Black Americans, a portion of their ancestry, often a fifth or more of their entire genetic makeup, traces back not to choice, not to shared community, and not to consent, but to an exercise of total control by people who legally owned their ancestors as property. It means recognizing that the mixed genetic identity found across Black America today is not, at its root, a simple story of cultures blending together naturally over time. Based on the genetic timeline itself, it is largely a story of coercion carried out at scale over generations that stopped almost the exact moment legal ownership of human beings came to an end. The numbers that geneticists now casually reference in academic papers, 15%, 20%, 25%, are, underneath the abstraction, a precise measurement of exactly how far that coercion reached into an entire population. There's also a scientific caution that has to sit alongside everything you have just heard, because it matters just as much as the striking numbers themselves. Modern genetics is very clear on one essential point. None of this means that race, in the sense of a rigid, clearly defined biological category, actually exists within the human genome. Researchers studying African American genetics are careful to emphasize that human populations do show real biological variation, but that variation tracks with specific and localized genetic differences rather than mapping neatly onto broad social categories like Black or white. The story being told here is not one of separate biological races colliding with one another. It is the story of a single, interconnected human population, artificially and violently divided by a social and legal system, whose forced genetic reunification is now being measured with remarkable precision. The science reveals the depth of historical violence. It does not and cannot validate the racial ideology that was used to justify that violence in the first place. That distinction matters enormously, and any version of this story that leaves it out is only telling half the truth. So, where does all of this leave us, with the data laid out in front of us and its implications still unfolding? It leaves an entire population whose genetic identity functions as a living archive of one of history's most brutal chapters, an archive that is, in some ways, more honest than the written record ever was, simply because it could not be selectively destroyed. It leaves a medical research establishment only now, in the last handful of years, scrambling to correct a blind spot that has already shaped health outcomes for generations, with new sequencing projects racing to close a gap that researchers themselves admit is still not fully closed. And it leaves millions of individuals holding test results that quietly answer questions their families' paper records never could, while opening up an entirely new set of questions that no genetic test has ever been able to fully answer. Because for every ancestry percentage a lab can calculate, there is a name that was never written down, a face that was never recorded, a specific human being, an enslaved woman, most likely, based on what the chromosomes reveal, whose exact identity has been permanently lost to history, even as the biological trace of what happened to her continues to live on inside millions of descendants who will never know her name. DNA can tell us how much. Through careful modeling, it can tell us roughly when. Through the quiet mathematics of the X chromosome, it can tell us something devastating about how. What it cannot tell us, and what may never be fully recoverable, no matter how advanced sequencing technology becomes, is exactly who. The individual women and men whose forced contributions to this shared genetic story were never written down anywhere, except inside the cells of their own descendants. And that brings us to the question this entire investigation ultimately circles back to one that no percentage, no statistical model, and no chromosome analysis has fully answered yet. As genetic sequencing becomes cheaper, faster, and more widely accessible across Africa and throughout the diaspora, and as these large-scale ancestry projects continue to expand, how much more of this hidden history is still waiting to surface, not only for African Americans, but for millions of people across the Americas whose family stories were shaped by these same forces and have never been examined this closely? What other silences, buried for centuries inside human DNA, are only now on the verge of finally being read? The science is moving faster than most people realize. The next comparison, the next before and after discovery, may not be years away. It may already be sitting in a lab somewhere, waiting to be published, and there is no telling yet exactly what it will force all of us to confront.